as well.
Come on, just give me the buttons to start presentation. Of course, half the screen is blocked by the Zoom thing, so I can't actually see.
You can normally move it at the top and pull it.
Doesn't like the look of that. Come on. Show.
If you want, Patrick, do you want me to attempt to share?
Do you know which one? Do you know which presentation it is? Because I couldn't get into
Yeah,
it's not the same one as last time, and I couldn't get into iShare this morning. That's why it's a version I was doing on Friday. Oh, come on.
Yeah, I think I've got the slides that Kathy sent.
So I'll stop sharing them. If I can. If I could even do that. Slick this, isn't it? It's going well so far. Stop sharing.
It is a Monday morning. Hey, that looks good.
Yep, we can see
screen.
that.
Yeah.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, looks great.
Cheers all, thank you. Yeah, so
is that, can you just go down a bit, Darren? Just check this is the same, it's the right one.
Yeah.
You're happy?
Can you just drop down a few slides so I can see my slides? Just check it's the right presentation there.
We're seeing all the slides.
People see that I'm moving through them.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, great, thank you.
Hi all. Sorry for the IT glitches with Welsh Government. I'm Darren Hatton, Head of Housing Standards in Welsh Government, and Patrick's joining me today to present some of the middle slides and is our technical expert on the planned approach to decarbonisation. And I can see he's rolling his eyes there, bigging him up before his slides, but he genuinely is put a huge amount of effort in getting us to the being close to launching the Welsh Housing Quality Standard 2023. So in terms of the aim of the session, my bit's quick run through, introduction, context. I think lots of people, if people have heard me before, it feels like a rehash or a rerun. Going to pass you over to Patrick then to explain the planned approach to part 3 of the standard. And we'll also give you some information around the feedback from the pilot studies for the targeted energy pathway, and we'll take questions on the planned approach. And then I'll cover, if Kathy's unable to join, I'll cover and outline the changes to the other elements of the standard, some of the new parts of the standard, and then we take questions and finish off with conclusions and next steps. So in terms of the context on why we're launching the standard now, the original standard was launched back in 2002, and although it had a bit of a revision in 2008, it is a standard that was 21 years ago now. The original standard was a bold and ambitious standard in its own right, and it resulted in significant change in the social housing sector, of raising standards to social housing, which has helped raise the bar in the quality of social housing and has helped during the current cost of living crisis with social housing tenants' energy bills from where we've come from in the past. It is the right time to be launching a standard now that all social landlords say they're fully compliant with the standard, or fully compliant, including acceptable fails. We went out, consulted last sort of late spring, early summer last year on the consultation. We had over 200 responses received from sort of a wide range of stakeholders, and those results were analysed by a research company, and we published the results released the results in December, and they made it onto the Welsh Government website in January. And there was clearly a wide range of views, from not going far enough with the standard to being too ambitious. The standard, when it launches, we're sort of refocusing and strengthening the areas around this being a tenant-focused standard that keeps both quality and anti-poverty requirements at its heart. There are small tweaks to core elements to ensure that tenants' voice is heard, but it also introduces new elements seeking to minimize the environmental impact of homes around decarbonisation, making homes more affordable to heat. So that's the affordable warmth element in part 3. There's new elements around, or not necessarily new elements, but improved elements around flooring throughout the house, minimizing exposure to noise, and as well, so increasing water efficiency, again linked to the future decarbonisation. Part 3 of the standard received the largest amount of feedback and is the biggest change to the standard. During the consultation, because of that feedback, it has resulted in some changes, which is where Patrick's going to present. But the Minister has agreed since the consultation with the planned approaches to be adopted. What this means in practice is all social landlords will be required to produce an affordable warmth and decarb plan within 3 years from the launch of the standard. And that the plan will set out when landlords will achieve the targets of environmental efficiency rating, so the EER of 92, which equates to an EPCA, and the environmental impact rating, the EIR of 92 for their housing stock. In terms of guidance, will be provided by ourselves in Welsh Government to set out how the plan is to be produced. The plans will include the whole stock assessment of all landlord properties, and this will outline the current EER and EIR ratings for the homes that each social landlord manage. Landlords will then need to produce a targeted energy pathway for each home, which will outline what they need to do to their properties to achieve the required targets. And the TEP, the targeted energy pathway, will include information on the timings of those improvements. In addition to the above, landlords will be expected to ensure that their homes reach a fabric-based EPC band C by 2029. And Welsh Government officials will assess the affordable warmth and decarbonisation plans and the evidence provided to ensure it indicates a viable timetable for implementation, the required improvements to achieve the targets we've set out in the standard. And I believe I'm handing over to Patrick now to give you a bit more details. Patrick, just let me know when you want me to move slides.
Can you hear me okay, firstly? Thank you. Great. So I've changed this. So we've done a presentation around part 3 and homes must be affordable to heat and have minimal environmental impact is the mouthful title of the section of WHQS that deals with this stuff. So we've done 3 workshops before, but they were mostly aimed at kind of asset managers and the way in which they need to gear up to handle this kind of idea that we have about a planned approach to improving the efficiency of homes. So what I've done this morning is I tried to focus going through each part of the standard and what that means for residents. And I thought that'd be more helpful for people whose jobs are to interact with, mostly to interact with residents and tenants, to just talk through each part of part 3. And the good news is that's shorter, because the previous one took about 25 minutes, and this is much, much shorter, as you're pleased to know. And it's a much simpler presentation to give. So if there's any questions, please just pitch in the chat, or Darren, if you've got anything to add, because I haven't done it in this way before, just please, if you think there's something missing from each part, just let me know. So there are 6 parts to it, I think, or 7. It's a good start. Don't know how many parts there are. 3A to F. 3A, heating systems must be reasonably economical to run and capable of heating the whole of the home to a comfortable level in normal weather conditions. It's all very kind of almost legalistic language around the standard. But the key part is that the bit in brackets at the end that says minimum of SAP 92 EPCA. This is the key. We think this is the key part of the new WHQS 23. And what that minimum of SAP 92 means is that fundamentally this ensures that residents and tenants can have homes that they can affordably heat. So really, really important stuff around like all the things we think about quality of homes. That we think that's probably one of the key ones because it affects so much else in people's lives. What does SAP 92 mean? Well, pre-energy shock, it meant electricity and gas bills for heating and hot water, mostly heating and hot water, a bit of other stuff as well, of around £120 a year, excluding excluding standing charges. But obviously that number has probably doubled and a bit since the kind of the core price of kilowatt hour per energy has gone up so much in the last 2-3 years. So it's probably sort of in the £200 to £300 per year range, but those are still aspirational for a lot of us in this call think that's an aspirational fuel cost per annum. But the point I want to stress is these homes exist, and they exist in the social stock in Wales. So that's the home on the right. That's not a new home. That's a retrofitted home under the optimised retrofit programme. I don't know exactly what the EPC of that home is, but the spec of it says it's somewhere in that kind of high 80s SAP. So this stuff. So the point about this stuff is aspirational, but it is achievable. But the challenge is it's not necessarily achievable on all homes in the landlord stock. So this kind of pre-A comes with some caveats for landlords about where there are homes that they think the measures are too expensive to do this to, or a thing I'll come on to in a bit, which is the kind of core of the planned approach, where landlords say, yes, we can get to this, but it's not going to be for a number of years, and this is how we're going to do it. And that's kind of what the planned approach is all about. So those are the kind of two major caveats for landlords. We're not the Welsh Government not expecting landlords to suddenly turn all of their homes into this standard, but we want them to progress towards this because we think as a society this is important. Unless you've got anything else to add, Darren, can I move on?
I haven't got anything else to add, so let's hope the slides carry on working. Does that 3B now?
Not yet, but yeah, cool, 3B. So 3B is similar to 3A, but it mirrors the carbon emissions. So yeah, I missed an important point. The 3A is actually about fuel cost, but 3B is about carbon emissions. So they're two related things around energy. But the way in which we ask landlords to think about this, and the image on the left kind of shows the point, we ask landlords to think about this for the whole of their stock rather than just for individual homes. So essentially what carbon emissions from homes must be minimized, and those are some legalistic words, but the kind of important bit is in the brackets, minimum of this thing called EIR, environmental impact rating of 92. And that, as a second bullet point says, is essentially a 90% cut in carbon emissions from 1990 levels and measured through this kind of universal tool for houses known as SAP, which is owned by the UK government. And there are a whole bunch of issues around Wales's ability to engage in that and change it and understand it. But yeah, that's a whole other conversation, which I'm happy to have. People have got questions about that. But I'll move on. Just to point, the important thing about 3B and carbon emissions is it's slightly controversial in WHQS because reducing carbon emissions doesn't directly benefit residents and tenants. Obviously, it doesn't particularly matter to a tenant, but it might matter to them personally in terms of kind of global heating, but it doesn't affect them how much carbon emissions are being made from their heating and hot water systems. But the reason it's in here is that it demands that landlords think through the challenges and deal with both the affordability for residents and tenants and the carbon emissions for residents and tenants, because what we don't want is that some point in the future, other legislation saying, no, you have to take all of these heating systems out because they're producing too much carbon, and then that would impact residents. We want basically to get social landlords to be ahead of the curve on thinking about carbon emissions. And if they do it, we think if they do it with the affordability, there are major benefits in terms of the way they think about their programs for renewing heating systems. So it's important the two are linked, but I think that 3A is first because that's the most important, and carbon emissions are a sort of secondary thing. So can I move on to 3C? Thanks, Darren. So this one, this isn't particularly relevant. So this morning, landlords must carry out a whole stock assessment and produce target energy pathways for their homes. This part is really aimed at the technical and the asset surveyors within landlords. This is the tool. These are the tools that set out when I was in 3A talking about the way in which we expect landlords to plan to get their homes to these targets. This is the set of words and guidance that we want landlords to follow in order to show that they have a planned approach to achieving these really important targets in 3A and 3B. There are some bits and pieces in 3C that are really relevant to residents, particularly stuff around changing climates, overheating and increased humidity. So within 3C, there's a link to some work that has been done by Cardiff Metropolitan University. And this was really about how the climate is changing, how fast the climate is changing in the next kind of 20, 30, 40 years, what that means for overheating in summertime for particular homes, and what that means in lots of homes around increased humidity, and increased humidity meaning more damp and more mold. And what we asked the researcher at Cardiff University to do, she wrote this amazing report last year, which is the thing that's in the slide about how resilient buildings in UK and Wales are, particularly how resilient housing is. And then we asked her to turn it into a series of fact sheets, and the fact sheets are relevant for both tenants and for landlords. So there are things in there that residents can do to help adapt for overheating and help adapt for increased humidity. So yeah, there's a really useful piece of resource in 3C. And ultimately in time, we want to bring the kind of the changing climate, the adapting to climate into the things we're doing around modifying for climate change as well, such that we're kind of doing things that are holistically good for homes around all of these issues, around affordability, around carbon emissions, around the changing climate. So there's a lot in that, even though it's not directly aimed at residents, actually aimed at the kind of the operation side of landlords. If I can move on. So I think these get increasingly easier as I go through now. So 3D was another bit of slight bit of technocraty stuff, I think. So this is essentially this is what we term a backstop in the policy. So what you'll note in 3A, it says all homes must be SAP 92. And then slightly further on, we're saying all homes must meet a minimum standard of SAP 75. The difference between those two is that SAP 92 is their kind of target over a number of years, possibly even decades or more than a decade, whereas we want them to meet a minimum of EPC Band C by 2029. So this was critical to ensure continuous improvement from WHQS 2008, which was a EPC Band D SAP 65. So we didn't want landlords do have homes that don't meet SAP 65, and we didn't want them to get left behind in kind of making them think about where they're going with their asset management. We wanted to ensure they have to still pick up the homes that didn't get to SAP 65 for a variety of valid reasons in WHQS 2008. It's also important to make sure landlords think about the order of the works, their whole stock. Lots of landlords do have programs to improve on their worst performing homes. So that's the kind of so essentially there is a range in terms of dealing with affordability of fuel. There's a minimum and there's an aspiration, and we are wanting landlords to plan within that space. And then this also aligns with other policy areas such as MEES, and I've got an exclamation mark in there because that MEES is acronyming. MEES is the UK government's minimum standard for private rented sector homes, which was planned to be an EPC-C, and the exclamation mark is there because that helpfully got cut in between me writing the presentation and this presentation. So that apparently no longer exists as we know at the moment, but Yeah, so that's just a little bit of detail about the kind of frustrations of working in this space. The MEES has been around MEES moving to EPCC has been around for a long time, and then suddenly it gets dropped. But there we go. Can I move on? Yep. So 3 really important homes, and in particular kitchens and bathrooms, must have an adequate amount of ventilation. I think this hasn't changed much from 2008, except that we've put the word kitchens and bathrooms must have mechanical ventilation in now. And this is to recognize the kind of the problem we're all aware of, is increasing damp and mold through people not being able to heat their homes properly, through the weather being increasingly warm and increasingly wet, and a very small subset of homes perhaps not being dealt with. So there might be a backlog of kind of repair and maintenance and improve amongst landlords. So yeah, we're kind of sharpening up a bit on the need for mechanical ventilation. Mechanical ventilation is really important because if you start to improve the energy efficiency of homes, they become less leaky, they hopefully become warmer, and then you've got more humidity and more water in the homes, and that means you need better ventilation because otherwise you do risk damp and mold. There is a correlation between external wall insulation and increasing damp in homes because the homes are more airtight. And the last point on there, landlords under the optimized retrofit program, landlords are increasingly installing mechanical ventilation heat recovery systems, and that's a really high quality system that ensures that homes have really good quality air, and the amount of humidity in the air is properly controlled. So I think the next one is my last slide. Hasn't changed for me yet. Thank you. So this is a new one. This is a thing that came out of the consultation, and we haven't quite got the wording right on this, so I just scribbled down what I thought the wording would be. Landlords must arrange for a smart meter to be installed. The must is because they have to do it. The arrange is because it's not normally the landlords that do this. It's the energy companies that do this. And smart meters are really important and increasingly important around the energy and the energy efficiency and affordability of warmth and carbon emissions kind of piece of the quality of homes, because it's not just how much energy we use that dictates the costs and carbon emissions. It's often when we use it. And their technology is becoming increasingly available, allows homes to be properly heated, but using energy when it's cheaper and emitting less carbon. And it's the technology such as things like smart meters and the measuring and monitoring equipment that's been installed under the optimized retrofit program that makes this a possibility for landlords to engage with, such that basically you can start to arrange for a home to be perfectly well heated, but for heat pumps not to switch on between kind of the peak electricity hours. And that has big benefits for residents in terms of cost. And then the last point on here is just a nod towards the concern about gathering data, which I get huge concern from lots of people. So for understanding homes, the data that Welsh Government gathers is not identifiable on the address level. So the data that's held in the Welsh Government's data lake is we know roughly where it is by postcode, but we don't know exactly where it is. So we know what the home is, but we don't know exactly where it is. So that's a really important point, that we're gathering all this kind of a huge cohort of data around homes, but it doesn't allow us to identify individual properties. So yeah, I'm sure that was a real blast through of WHQS Part 3. Touched on lots of issues, and I hope there are some questions.
Thank you both. Yeah, it looks like we do have one question already from Michelle. I don't mind reading it. Michelle, did you want to ask it live, or I can read it as well?
No, I'm happy for you to read. That's fine. Thanks.
Yep, perfect. So Michelle asked, in regard to smart meters, in some areas of connectivity, Wi-Fi How can this be overcome by landlords in order to meet this standard?
It's a good question. There are. Go on, Patrick. If
No, I think that would have to be because it's not a landlord, because it's the rollout of them is by the energy companies. I think where landlords couldn't do that, there would have to be a caveat for that. I think it's the what I would say to that. I don't know. I assume naively that the energy companies have a way around that. But I don't know what. I don't actually know enough about that.
So we've got some stuff through the Innovative Housing Program Optimized Retrofit, where there's actually, this is going to sound sort of like Doctor Who or Torchwoody, there is like a low frequency network that is free to use and is used for monitoring data linked to the program that we've got with Trustmark. So I wasn't aware of it until we started using it, but the smart meter companies can use that other network for low level data. So there is a system in place to collect smart meter data, even in areas which have poor data. So I'm aware of that. I cannot for the life of me think what the acronym is for that, but it's something like low frequency, so-and-so.
Lot of them.
Yeah, so there's a lot of, there is ways and means of doing that. In addition, though, in the standard, there is an emphasis on social. There is one part of the standard which talks around broadband and social landlords ensuring connectivity so that tenants are not digitally excluded in the future. So those two hand in hand should also resolve some of the smart meter issues going forward.
Can I jump in there as well? I think this is where TPAS will run some follow-up events for things like, you know, how do we, there'll be some resistance, you know, that Tin Hat Brigade, you know, in terms of not wanting a smart meter. I think Pobble Group, when they did Penderry, you know, that was one of the biggest retrofit projects so far. They had some resistance. And I think there's some lessons we can learn around smart meter implementation. Maybe we could have a comms group talking about it, how we're going to communicate, and also try and break down some of those myths as well. I remember my first smart meter, when I then switched supplier, I had to have another smart meter put in, which just seemed bonkers to me. A lot of those things have been ironed out, so some of those common misconceptions. So if people are interested, I think this could be some, I think there'll be a number of WHQS follow-up sessions TPAS will run where we talk about subject-led ones, and that feels already probably one of them, isn't it? Smart meters. Yeah.
Yeah. And the other thing around that, that last part of the standard, then tenant refusal is part of the mix. The tenant can refuse that smart meter. What the situation would be is at change of tenancy, then there would be a smart meter. So then when a new occupier was in, the smart meter would be there ready in future. So that's one of the processes in terms of tenants who existing tenants more than happy. They can refuse the smart meter and the social landlord wouldn't need to insist on it. And then at change of tenancy, it'd be one of the interventions that the landlord would then take ahead of a new tenant moving into a property. So it's one of those sort of slow over time processes as well.
Do you have any other questions at the moment? David, I know you said you have a few questions.
I've got 5. Please, anyone else first, because I can always pick this up with them afterwards. But can I maybe start with 1 or 2?
Yeah.
So I think the point about 3A and 3B, where you're talking about the standards, are really important. Last week, one of the social landlords put on TikTok, we achieved EPCA, and I was like, yay! But the gas boiler was still in there, and I get how you can get EPCA still with gas, but that feels to me, maybe because I'm more involved in climate change, you know, it feels like a loss. That I'd be gutted as a tenant if they did all the work and I'm still burning gas in my house. And I think that would be an interesting one for tenants: is do they have any right to ask for their gas, you know, to decarbonize? Because that was originally, I thought, the point of this. So I think that's an interesting one. I don't think there's necessarily an answer to it, but it's one thing to thrown up for me. Yeah.
Can I respond?
Yeah.
Briefly, I'll just too brief because it's a fascinating area.
Yeah.
Like I have seen homes that have gas boilers in, but are really respond to the whole, like if the home is really well insulated and has you could still get away, you could still have a gas boiler, just about. And it's very controversial. I mean, yeah, basically it's really about the whole piece. I think is the important point. And
Yeah,
I think that for some properties, sorry, yeah, go on, Darren. I'm digging myself in a hole.
No, I don't think you are in that sense. So the whole part of this, David, at the moment is how do we introduce a standard that hits that affordable warmth, so what tenants experience.
Yeah.
And the crude blunt measure that is SAP and EPC ratings, and EPC A is a clear indication of how much that tenant will pay for their thermal comfort, and therefore it is EPCA regardless of the fuel used. The check and balance on that then, I suppose, is the environmental impact rating of a SAP of 90, not SAP because it's not SAP, EIR of 92 as well. But that can be averaged across their stock. So they could have some low carbon houses or zero carbon houses. They could be new build linked to our other standard, which is the WDQR. So that is EPCA now for new build, and with a non-fossil fuel heating and hot water system. So those systems, and when they're built and they'll have a high EIR, they could potentially offset some of their properties that have gas boilers and get an average of 92 across their stock portfolio. But the key thing of this part, the standard, is that the end goal is to get all existing houses up to EPCA as well, so the tenant experiences that individual bill. We are looking, so we talk about SAP being a blunt tool. We're launching a standard at 10.2. By 2025, we're going to have SAP 11, and as a government, we're involved in those discussions of where SAP 11 takes us and movements, etc. And as we get to SAP 11, it will be a measure that is also factoring net zero, because the standard assessment procedure, which is SAP, was never intended to be net zero in its original thing. So we're moving there. And again, this standard is meant to have about a 10-year shelf life. So that might not seem, but there's a lot of work and a lot of pushback from the sector around the standard, that we want the standard now to put us in a direction of travel that takes us to 2033 to then be able to launch a newer standard, which will hopefully address other issues going forward. And remember, even though Patrick had in his slide there around MEES and the announcements a week and a bit ago now by the UK government Prime Minister, the rollback on some of those standards and gas boilers specifically was to go from 100% in 2035 down to 80%. Well, in Wales, we've always had the mantra that the social housing stock is better. So we see that as all social housing stock would still follow that timeline of 2035 anyway, because it only makes up a small percentage of the overall stock. And the UK government's target is still 80% by 2035 for gas boilers. So it's one of those things. It's a slow process, isn't it? It's a bit like the EV cars. That was announced 3 years ago for a 10-year period to wean us to a thing that all new cars would be banned for combustible engines going forward. And now we see the clarity and the detail in the word, and it wasn't quite like that anyway in the first place. But yeah, it's a real complicated one. But we are trying to make and steer in that direction, that the focus is around affordable warmth for the tenant and decarbonisation of the stock.
I don't disagree. It's just, yeah.
I do get it, but gas currently is 3 times cheaper per kilowatt hour. The counter argument is that a heat pump done correctly you should get a coefficient of performance of around about 3. So for every kilowatt you put in, you should generate 3 kilowatts of heat. So we're at a threshold, aren't we?
Yeah. What you've done, I think, is the correct thing. It's just if I still had gas in my house after all that, I'd be gutted, you know. But I get it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Have we got any more questions? Or should I ask another one?
I was going to say, I pick up a comment from Lucy in the chat about being involved in more WHQS sessions. We really like to sort of spread out our sort of sessions and awareness to anyone. So if I put my email in the chat, happy for people to reach out and we'll get you on a mailing list for upcoming events. And in terms of the other question in the chat around when are we planning to launch, the oral statement for the ministers due on the 24th of October. Still a lot of work to do before then, but the ministers expected to stand up in the Senedd and in effect introduce the new standard.
Great. David, do you have any more questions?
I guess one of the ones that concerns me is I was at an event last week where a lot of Vale, Morgan, Caerphilly, lots of your technical people were at. It was at the Robert Price Centre. We saw this innovation in damp and mold, net zero, and all your people there, all your technical people were like, yeah, great, this is brilliant. And then when people asked, oh, is it on SAP points? Will I get the, will it actually get ticked off? They were like, no, we're about 3 years off or 4 years off. And I guess that's the issue we've got, is we're measuring something, but the technology is moving faster and quicker and can't seem to get on the scale. And I know there was a couple of gutted technical people last week getting really excited about solutions like your mechanical, recovery, things like that. And some of the really exciting stuff is years away. And that makes me wonder, are we measuring the right thing? I know why you went down EPC, but yeah.
Yeah, and to that, David, it's a really good point. So one of the examples I use is a water tank. That's a smart water tank that heats water. Even though it's got a body of water, and a water tank in effect is for want of a better thing, a dumb kettle. It'll heat the whole body of water. There are now other water tanks which supposedly atomize the water and heat just a certain element to make it more efficient. And the key thing for one of those technologies, or one of the products, was that they worked really hard to make sure that they got into something called Appendix Q, so that it was counted in the SAP. So there is a pathway for people to get into Appendix Q and to get their products in there, and then they start counting in the SAP. And the other thing is, when we get to SAP 11, there's discussion around the core part of the SAP system and then wrappers around it. For SAP 11 sounds complicated, but there could be like a geographical wrapper for Wales, one for Scotland, and different regions in England, etc. That it'll be more live. There'll be more updates on the system linked to fuel prices, for instance, and the volatility in fuel prices. So it sounds like some of the issues encountered is addressed by SAP 11, and when that's rolled out from 2025, and there'll be more updates. Because historically, and we've only had SAP 10.2 for a little while, we've been on SAP version 9, which I think come out in 2012. So there are updates coming for SAP, which will hopefully address those issues. Like you mentioned about the Sustainable Energy Centre in Newport, out Robert Price, things around, say, water efficiency, which we'll come on to later on, where if you're having a shower, the warm water, as it goes down the waste pipe, heats some of the cold water coming into the shower as a efficiency as well. And those things will eventually work their way into the processes. But it is a frustration as well.
Anybody else? Any questions?
Yeah, I don't see any other questions. I did mention in the chat that Elizabeth, our policy officer, will, I'm sure, be keeping regular updates with Darren and the rest of the team, and be making regular updates to members.
I make 2 points. Sorry, Hannah.
Right.
But all the people here, in terms of one of the things we'll be working with is the tenants to track WHQS too, and tenant groups, how they can monitor it. People like Kamar that had great working groups that helped work through the WHQS originally. There's 2 things that I want tenants to look at in this. Is one is asset sales. We've already had some landlords saying, oh, that one may not be worth doing, let's sell it off and things like that. That concerns me greatly. That was paid for with taxpayer money or tenant rent, and just so asset sales are one that we'll be talking to politicians and the minister and things about. That's one I want tenants to look at, rather than taking the cheap option of selling it off. And the other one is the EPC assessments. You'll have technical people going, right, that's an A, that's a B, that's a C. Now, in the private sector, we've seen examples where, like, a tenant it was assessed a D, and they were still cold and they were still things. So they had their own one done, and it came out as E, which was meant it was illegal to let it. I still don't know enough about EPCs, and I don't pretend to, but maybe how do we do independent inspections? Do we need some sampling? Because your people are going to be under pressure, your in-house person, to get those standards up, get the right badges on them. And I just wonder whether we need something around sampling and testing. That's something where TPAS is coming from. I don't know if you think.
Cheers, David. I'll pick up on the first one. Patrick, yeah. I don't know in terms of the second one and the SAP assessments, whether you'd be more expert at that than myself. On the first point around disposals, because it's a difficult property, we're hearing the same from social landlords in terms of, is this economical for this particular house, etc. Now, what I would say is things such as the optimized retrofit program, that test and learn approach, and normalizing this work and sorting the supply chain out for things to become cheaper, is that over time things should become more economical to decarbonize. For me as well, that we have a serious issue with people on the common register, and we've got about 11,000 people in temporary accommodation across Wales. What we don't want to do is to shrink the social housing stock. This is about growing it. With our new build targets, which puts pressure on the sector. We get the issues that are there at the sector at the moment. We're asking them to do more on the new build. We're asking them to be involved on the optimized retrofit program, decarbonisation. We're raising the standards of their existing homes. We're saying there's transitional accommodation capital program to deal with the people in temporary accommodation. And not only that, we're improving or tightening up sort of building safety regulations. There is a lot of pressure on them from government being stretched a lot of ways without sort of high inflation, and raising sort of the cost of debt through interest rates. So there's a lot of pressure on them, but the minister's very clear that disposals are an absolute last resort, and that'll be the message coming from ourselves as government, that we completely discourage disposals. It's around making sure it's economical and viable at the right time, which will hopefully come out through the whole stock assessment and targeted energy pathway, which hopefully segues into assessments of the property's energy efficiency then.
Yeah, thanks, Darren. So it touches on the point you made previous, David, about the whole domestic energy assessor and SAP assessments. So, the first things when talking about this to technical colleagues and landlords, we always point out that the SAP is a model, so it's just guidance. It doesn't tell you how that home actually performs. It tells you under a set of particular normalized normalized conditions what that home might do. So so there's always that variability. There's also it's great. It's a great tool for looking at the whole. If you've got thousands of homes, and many landlords do, it's a great tool for looking at the entirety of your stock. But it's not so great. What I'm told by experts in the field is that when you're looking at thousands of homes, the averaging is fantastic. But looking at individual homes, it does create. We all know anecdotally that, like, you look at your own home and go, that doesn't make any sense. So it does. That's the first point. So it's a guidance thing. The second thing is, I think, which talks to your point about the kind of having home reassessed and it changing. There is work to be done with the pool of people known as domestic energy assessors, and these are the people that actually do the EPC certificates. So I think we are, through the optimized retrofit program, trying to encourage landlords to train their own staff to be retrofit assessors, domestic energy assessors, and because they have a background in housing, their assessments of what the home is will be a much higher quality than a domestic energy assessor. Could be someone who finished being a teacher last week and is now assessing people's homes. And I know from my personal experience of dealing with them, they may not know actually any basic information about homes. So yeah, I think there's a lot of work to do. There are problems with SAP, but we haven't thrown it away, partly because we don't have the resources to rewrite it, honestly. And it also has, but it has a lot of value. So I think it still has a lot of value. I think we defend it strongly as a tool.
Yeah. Sorry, I hope that didn't make sense.
Or have we given you a typical government answer, which is to talk and not answer the question?
I hope not.
It does concern as you say, the people I've met in housing, the people I met, Robert Price from Hobble and all those others last week, they really care. They are professional, really care. I've got I'm not in question their integrity, but we're seeing in the private sector whole different grades, 2 different grades by 2 different assessors doing the same property, and that concerns me when we're in a race to get all these properties up. There is going to be some pressure on getting the right points, the right assessments. And as a tenant organisation, we have to challenge that. Yeah.
I was going to say, I think Patrick's answers is really key there, in a sense, and sort of maybe in the private sector as well. It's a little bit like getting an estate agent to do a valuation, and you end up picking the highest one because that's the price you would really like to sell it at, or mortgage evaluations that the bank will send a valuer and it'll be lower than what you would get as an individual because that valuer is working for the bank. I get the sort of the sentiment there, David. It's they're meant to be independent, so it wouldn't be sort of a POBL assessor doing a SAP assessment and score on POBL property. Is that
no?
Right,
they can be. No, they can be.
They can be.
I mean, it's an assessed role. The domestic energy assessor has a certain percentage of their properties that they've assessed looked at, so it's independent.
Okay.
So it's an independent professional role. So you could work for a housing association and do domestic energy assessments on that housing association.
I was sitting next to the Mellon and the Caerphilly one. I would trust them over someone who got a 400 quid qualification any day of the week. The in-house ones, they were good.
Yeah, good. Should we move on to given the sort of time, move on to the other elements that are new in the standard, and then a bit of time then for questions. So if I share my screen again.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Cheers, Patrick. Sorry, Hannah.
No, it's all good.
Yeah. So one of the other elements we touched on earlier on being introduced is around water efficiency, and landlords are asked to reduce potential consumption to less than 110 litres per day per person by adhering to performance standards and when replacing fittings and fixed appliances. So that's similar to what you mentioned earlier on around things that David mentioned about seeing certain products at Robert Price and that Sustainable Energy Centre. There are things on the market now, products available, which will help reduce that water consumption or potentially reduce that water consumption. In addition, and this one's caused a little bit of pushback from the sector, our social landlords are asked to install water butts where appropriate on properties. We've put clarification around that in terms of it'll be generally at change of tenancy. There was a push to ask for it being a tenant choice, but for us, it feels like, to myself, very much a climate mitigation factor. And if we come back to having, although it's where appropriate, so certain social houses, it may not be appropriate due to physical limitations, etc., around putting water butts on properties. But it's a bit of a climate mitigation for preventing future flooding risk, and maybe not in the geographical location, but further downstream. That if you've got 230,000 properties and they've all got 90 litres of water butts, you end up with a lot of water not avoiding getting into rivers and then flooding further downstream. So it's just one of those kind of things that we're being trying to keep it so it's where appropriate rather than tenant choice. But that was just one of the new elements, which will then obviously help with the higher up, that maybe tenants will use their hoses less. If they've got a full water butt, they'll be able to water gardens, etc., from the water butt. The other new element around flooring, and was at a specific Tide Power event last week around flooring, and linking into work that Elizabeth at TPAS has done previously. The old standard on flooring was that suitable flooring in kitchens, bathrooms, and utility rooms. The new one now is at change of tenancy, all habitable rooms, including bedrooms, living rooms, and staircase, as well as staircases and landings located within the home, should have suitable floor coverings. That doesn't mean at change of tenancy ripping out the old flooring and putting new in at every change of tenancy. That's around social landlords making a judgment call as to whether there is the flooring that is already present is suitable ahead of the change of tenancy. There's also a new element around noise, and that element covers threats to physical and mental health resulting from exposure to noise inside the home caused by lack of sufficient sound insulation. What it doesn't cover is unreasonably noisy behaviour of neighbours, whether that's domestic or commercial. There's also part of the standards around biodiversity. An opportunity should be introduced by social landlords who own or manage verges, parks and grounds and open space by changing their management of these areas to make them more wildlife friendly. And then I think this is one of my final slides before coming on to questions. There's a new element linked to active travel / sustainable travel around lockable external storage. We've had a bit of feedback that the last part of Standard 7 and the first part of Standard 8 have that sort of merger between external storage. So we're looking ahead of launching the standard, a bit of clarity around those two parts of it. But tenants must have access to a robust and lockable external store, which should include sufficient space for secure storage of bicycles, pushchairs, and mobility aids to encourage sustainable travel. And there's some clarity in the standard around the number of spaces should be equal to the number of bedrooms of the respective home. And I think it's at that point, that's my final slide for any questions.
I'm reading one of the questions that we just got in the chat. So Bethan's asked, apologies if I'm showing my ignorance. I welcome the changes that will benefit the tenants, but does the Welsh Government have plans to provide financial support to housing associations to meet the targets?
The $2 billion question.
Good question.
Yeah. It's a good question. I think letters have gone out to all the social landlords ahead of launching a standard. And we're all aware of how tough financial situations, whether it's in our personal or our organizational finances, and sort of covered off the pressures earlier on. I think I run with the terminology that this new standard is a bold and ambitious standard, and the messaging with the minister is at some point we've got to announce a bold and ambitious financial package around this standard. I keep referring back to when we introduced the programme for government in 2021, which was 20,000 new low carbon socially rented homes. In addition, we launched the WDQR 2021, which was a new raised standard from DQR, which said EPCA and non-fossil fuel heating and hot water systems. The social housing grant budget, which was primarily used to deliver on that target, went from around 120, 130 million a year to now it's 325 million a year. The minister has done this in the past, managed to find new money and lots of it to meet a bold and ambitious target for the social housing sector. So that's the messages we're giving the minister. What we have said in the short term is we know what our budget is for this year and next year, which includes major repairs allowance, dowry, and the optimised retrofit programme, which is around circa 200 million this year, 200 million next year. What we don't know is the budget settlement for the future years, and that's what we need to come out to the sector with. So Bethan, there is more to come around financial support for meeting this standard from ourselves.
Right. Yeah, that sounds great. And I see, Sean, your hand is up.
Yeah, just touching on the flooring. Obviously that's a big game changer for every social housing. Who will take responsibility for the carpets when they are in? So in terms of if we put a door in now, we have to replace it if it's broken. Where do we sit with carpets if they're damaged or the wear and tear? You know, who takes that responsibility?
Yeah, no, Sean, it's a great question. It's come up in the other workshops as well. And as I mentioned last week, I was at the TPAS and Type How event, where they were discussing flooring and the processes around that. And there are options around that, so that, because it's not necessarily the landlord who is putting in the new flooring. There has been discussions around service charging, if it's something that a social landlord's put in new and then has to maintain, that it could be service charging. But there's also conversations around gifting. So if the carpenter is gifted and that's agreed in the tenancy, then that isn't something then that you as a landlord would be expected to manage the upkeep and maintenance of that carpet. So there's ways and means around that introduction. And one of the things and the intention around this is around that reducing of waste, etc., of ripping out suitable flooring at change of tenancy, just because that's the process that's always happened in the past, and then leaving it to chance then with tenants to floor carpet this, do weather carpeting or lamenting themselves. There will be further information after launching the standard around how this works in practice, but we do get the sector are concerned around that. And I think one of the other maintenance people were saying, yeah, but previously the standard was kitchen, bathrooms and utility rooms made up about 20% of the floor area, and now you're asking us to do the other 80%. So we do get the concerns from the sector, but I don't know if David or anyone else from TPAS,
Yeah.
I know Elizabeth's not on, but
Yeah,
there is some
Sean,
research.
We've got really good working group going. So somebody from your organisation, if you don't know who, we can let us know and we'll put you in touch with somebody.
Yes, all right, yeah.
Yeah, with who've been working on different models, gifting, transfers. We've looked at lots of different ways of dealing with the flooring issue. So Elizabeth on the team is our expert on it, but I know the group's quite a substantial group now of representatives across Wales. So it might be we just need to put you within your organisation with somebody, you know.
Yeah, if we could, please.
Yeah.
But good question, Sean. Cheers.
Yes.
It looks like from Sarah, sorry, there was a question around kind of the skills gap. This is something that we touch on a lot, that we've touched on with Malcolm from ORP, the ORP team. So she says, is there also financial support to address the skills gap in the sector to be able to deliver this standard?
So I suppose there's 2 points to clarify on that. Is it the skills gap within the social housing organisation specifically, and there is a skills gap around the wider repairs, maintenance and improvement sector on decarbonisation? And I think there is support for both sides in that sense going forward. We are working, and Malcolm's probably the best person to answer around that, but in terms of what we're looking to do with supply chain and skills gap education and training for your contractors. But in addition, and I know Patrick is sort of straddles the two teams in both the standards team and ORP, but within the allocation of the ORP grant, you are allowed to use the ORP money towards whole stock assessment, targeted energy pathway, and sort of training of staff, I believe, within the social landlord.
Great. Perfect. And do we have any other questions? I don't see any in the chat. I don't think I missed any.
Can I jump in? Sorry,
Yeah.
again. If there's any sessions that people want to run further, we intend to run a number of them with Welsh Government or by ourselves. So things like the water butts, you know, it said, was it reasonable was the term, or where appropriate? I think we should have a conversation about what that means, not just how you see it as a landlord, but from a tenant. Because in my house, I'm in a terrace like this. I look front garden. I don't have any downpipes. They all go to next doors. So is that the landlord going to go, well, you're not going to have one? I'd love one. So does the tenant have a right to one? You know, we cut I think we need to have those conversations as a group to interpret these rules, as are all of them. So also your tenants, do they need to know what all this WHQS means? We'll run a session probably, which is, you know, WHQS 2 for dummies, you know, type thing, as in what the tenants need to know what it means for them. So do let us know if there's any sessions. And I know Darren probably would feel the same, wouldn't he?
Yeah, to come in on that, David. Yes, in that sense, we've got so there's something called the Housing Decarbonisation Community of Practice, which has spun out from the new build side on the Innovative Housing Programme, and then we've sort of grown that network, included standards in there, included the optimised retrofit programme in there. There is lots of different things that we do in that community of practice. I think in April we had an event where we had 140 people at the cricket ground and 90 people streaming online, which meant an event with 230 sort of eyeballs on us. It's something that we want to carry on, and also within that spin off lots of other communities of practice, and how we can get tenants involved in that is something I'm keen to see how we can do more of that going forward. You were right, when we launched the standard, we're not just going to go into hiding as a government for a couple of years and then come out and find out how people are doing with the standard, how we're going to meet that. There is just as much engagement and work after launching the standard, or more work in effect, to be able to get out through teething problems, issue guidance, etc. What we hadn't touched on today, I suppose, was we've got a pilot at the targeted energy pathway. 2 social landlords have done that already, but we're looking to pilot with 3 other social landlords. That will happen and results of that will happen after the launch. So there'll be things to be finessed with guidance, etc., after we launch the standard. You mentioned about the flooring. I think that's something, yes, given the noise in the sector, we would like to sort of link up and how we can do those kind of things. One other thing, which is slightly off topic, but comes back to sort of Sarah James's comment earlier, is people are probably not aware there's something called the Zero Carbon Performance Hub, which Welsh Government are putting 3 years of funding into. It becomes a virtual hub that's a centre for excellence for decarbonisation, both new and existing housing, specifically for social landlords. So the website's live at the moment, but realistically, content from the hub in earnest starts from January, February time onwards, and that over its 3-year life, and we expect it to go on for longer than that, will create training material and training courses for social landlords around decarbonisation. In the first instance, there'll be monitoring and evaluation reports from both the Innovative Housing Programme on the new build and optimised retrofit. It'll look to pull in examples from across the UK and Europe around decarbonisation programmes. And it will also include an A to Z of renewable and decarbonisation products that can be used in houses. So it becomes a little bit like a trip advisor for decarbonisation for social landlords. And that's the hope for that going forward, and all social landlords will have access to that.
Great. All right, well, on that note, David, do you have any other comments, questions?
No, stop now. Stop now.
All right, well then, if there aren't any other questions, Darren or Patrick, do you have anything else that you want to add?
The only other thing I was going to mention, it's a little bit, you would only need to watch for about 10 minutes at the moment, but the Welsh Government YouTube channel now has a dedicated playlist for housing decarbonisation. And there will be more content around housing decarbonisation coming forward over the sort of next 6 months via that YouTube channel. So on the official Welsh Government channel, there's a playlist for housing decarbonisation. And we'll get more and more stuff, but that'll also be advertised via the hub as well. So there'll be a push with the sector to make them aware of the hub going forward.
That's great. Yeah, I'll definitely have to take a look at that. I'm sure David will as well. I think you're on mute, David.
I'm already looking for it as we're talking.
I'll post a link.
That sounds great. Perfect. Well, then, if we don't have any other comments or questions, I think we'll call this session, to a close. So thank you so much, Darren and Patrick, for coming and sharing all of your knowledge and information with us. And thanks to everybody for logging on and taking part. Again, this is recorded, so I can send it to the group once it's downloaded to my computer. And yeah, if you have any other questions, you can either email myself or David, and we can get you in touch with Darren and Patrick then. So with that, thanks so much for coming. Yeah, we'll see you next time.